Hi, welcome to the Bible Standard, where you are guaranteed in-depth Bible study and analysis. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and drop a comment in the comments area to have your say, and we'll do our best to reply.
We're going to be considering the most wonderful man who...
We've been progressing through the Gospels. We've been going through the life of Jesus. And tonight we're going to stop for a little while in Matthew chapter 13 and have a look at this parable of the sower, but also just unpack this chapter a little bit where the sower is found. Now, we want to focus mainly on Matthew's account, but you can find the parable of the sower in Mark and in Luke, which generally are known as the Synoptic Gospels. So they are in the other Gospels, but we want to focus in on Matthew's account tonight because Matthew makes a really big thing about parables. You may remember that Matthew's Gospel is built around 5 speeches. Okay, something we looked at on a previous lecture, looking at Matthew's Gospel and the Sermon on the Mount. And I won't go through this again in any detail, but you may remember that Matthew, he has these pillars in his Gospel where Jesus makes a speech and then he builds the story through that. And here's the 5 pillars of his Gospel, the 5 speeches of his Gospel. And you may remember the reason that they're all unique is they all end in the phrase, when Jesus had ended all these sayings. So something I've done, something that maybe you might choose to do as well, is just to colour that phrase in. It highlights this is a feature of Matthew's Gospel. And so, of course, in between all of those speeches is the storyline, the narrative. Why 5? Not particularly certain on that. But it is interesting that Matthew is presenting, and we said this on the previous occasion, he's presenting Jesus as the new Moses. And you may remember that Moses was, of course, the first leader of God's people when God made them a kingdom back in Exodus 19. Okay? But that kingdom is to be revived, but this time with Jesus as its leader, its ruler, its king. So Jesus is the new leader, the new Moses. And just as there were 5 books of Moses, so Matthew's presenting Jesus in this same manner. There are 5 speeches of the final leader. So first leader, final leader. And all the speeches have to do with the kingdom. Okay, they all have to do with the kingdom. The first and the last speech are about character of the kingdom, what type of person will be in the kingdom, what type of person will be excluded from the kingdom. The second and fourth speeches are about the conduct of those in the kingdom when you're out preaching, doing mission work, or when you're in the ecclesia amongst brothers and sisters. And then the one that's going to take our interest tonight, because this is the third speech in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 13 looks at the substance of the kingdom. So, hopefully you're still all in Matthew. In Matthew chapter 13, we come across 8 parables. Okay, there are 8 parables all clustered together in Matthew chapter 13. So, I've just put number 1, number 2, number 3 next to each so I can just readily see the 8 parables. So the first one is the one we're going to be looking at, and it's the primary one. It's the one that gets unpacked the most. It sets the scene, it sets the tone of what parables are for and how parables work. The parable of the sower. Who knows what the next parable is? What's the next parable in chapter 13? Let's see if we can unravel them together. No, you're jumping ahead a little. No, before that, we have the tares. Okay, so the parable of the tares, verse 24 to 30. All right. Then the mustard seed. The parable of the mustard seed. Okay, verse 31. And some of these parables end up only being one verse sometimes. Like very small, just a one-liner, a lesson to be learnt that's very simple. The parable of the mustard seed. Hard on the heels of that is the parable of the leaven. One verse, verse 33. Who knows where the next ones are? How far do we have to go down to? Verse 44, right? So we get 3 consecutive parables, all in a row, very, very quickly. The parable of the hid treasure, the parable of the pearl of great price, the parable of the fish net. Is fish plural, or is it fisher's net? Fish net. And then there's one more. Anyone know where the last parable is? What's the last parable? Some don't include this, but it's clearly, you'll see this in a moment, there's a pattern in here, and it has to be one of the parables. What one, Mark? What's it called? Verse 52. I've called it the parable of the householder. All right, the parable of the householder. So there we are. 8 parables. But this chapter is more than just 8 parables clumped together. Okay, Matthew's far more accomplished than that. All right, and although it's not our subject to examine this chapter in detail, I think it's actually a fun thing to do, to just see how Matthew's put this together. Remember, Matthew, what was his occupation? What was Matthew? What was his job? A tax collector. Okay, so sort of like an accountant, bookkeeper, all right? Works for the Australian government, maybe, collecting our revenue for taxes, equivalent to someone doing bookkeeping, all right? So you'd think he would be quite accurate in what he does and how he formulates things, and he'd be quite ordered. And he is. He's very ordered, very structured, and yet still very simple. So here's the first thing to note about this speech. Because this speech takes place over 2 locations. Okay? It's divided into 2 halves. Now, we didn't read the whole chapter for sake of time, but had we read the whole chapter, we would have seen that 4 of the parables were given outside to crowds. The other 4 parables were given inside to the disciples. Okay, so 4 parables outside, 4 parables inside. So you'll see in verse 36, Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him. But if you go back to verse 1, the same day went Jesus out of the house and sat by the seaside, and great multitudes gathered together to him. So clearly 2 distinct halves. And the 8 parables are split right down the middle, 4 here, 4 there. But now I want you to notice that what Matthew does with these parables is that he groups them together. Have you ever noticed this? How he groups them together into pairs. All right, so now you know all the parables. The first 2 parables, what were they again? Parable of the sower and the parable of the tares, okay? What's in common with those 2 parables? Well, they're both about seeds and sowing, quite clearly. Matthew's put these 2 together, all right? A sower sows seed that falls into different soils, parable of the sower. A sower sows wheat while the enemy comes along and sows tares in the night, okay? So 2 parables about seeds and sowing. The next 2 parables, remember what they were? The mustard seed, okay, and the leaven. So what do they have in common? Well, in both cases, something very small ends up being extremely large, like exponentially large, unexpectedly large. This little seed, okay, grows, and it's a herb of some description. Try and find any herb that's able to have birds come and nest in the little bush. Well, the mustard seed grows sufficiently tall enough for birds to come and rest in the tree It's called a tree. It's quite exceptional. And here's a woman, she takes this little bit of yeast and she puts it into her dough mixture, enough to make 3 loaves of bread. All right, quite extraordinary how yeast does that and just expands exponentially. So parables about growth. The next 2 parables. I think this one's quite easy to detect because the language in this repeats itself. Okay, so you've got the hid treasure, the parable of the hid treasure, where a man finds field treasure. He's out there with his metal detector and it just goes off the chart. Okay, and he thinks, wow. Okay, and he goes and buys that field, but first he sells everything he's got to buy the field. Okay? Well, the next parable is the parable of the merchant, the jewelry merchant, who's been all his life looking for that really, really precious pearl. Okay, and he's got his microscope and he's been checking them all and he hasn't found it. And then he comes across one which is so beautiful, he has to sell everything to buy it. So 2 parables about selling everything to buy something that's valuable. And they're put right next to each other. Okay, so that leaves the last 2. You're getting the pattern now. They're all grouped in pairs. So the last 2, one about the fisher's net and one about the householder. What links these 2 together? Well, they're actually parables about 2 opposite things. So you'll notice in the fisher's net, okay, in verse 48, which, when it was full, they drew to shore and sat down and gathered the good into vessels and cast the bad away. So there's good and bad in this net. But down in verse 52, and good is positive and bad is negative, clearly, okay? Good is accepted and bad is rejected. So that's about positive and negative. But down in verse 52, this householder, it says, every scribe which is instructed unto the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is a householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasures things new and old. Okay, clearly that's opposite, things new and things old. Both positive in this case, but still opposite things. And so this is what Matthew's done. Matthew, the accountant, the ordered writer, structures it all together and puts it together so it's quite easy to see and identify what's going on. It's pretty neat, I think. But there's more. Because what Matthew does is he takes the first and the last parable and he identifies these parables as about individuals seeking the kingdom. Okay, individuals seeking the kingdom. Somebody who's going out of their way to identify with and discover and be associated with the kingdom. So, go back a page. When he gives the interpretation of the parable in verse 18, Jesus says this, hear ye therefore the parable of the sower, when any one, so this is talking about people, okay, when any one heareth the word of the kingdom and understandeth it not, in the case of the wayside, but then over in verse 23, but he that receives seed into the good ground is he that heareth the word and understands it. So it's about your comprehension of the kingdom, okay? You're seeking the kingdom. Do you understand it or do you not? And the last parable about the householder, which we just read, which, because it's such a long chapter, it's over the page again. So verse 52, then he said unto them, therefore every scribe which is instructed unto the kingdom. Okay, so this is a householder, a person who is instructed, who has a clear understanding. And so I've put a link between the word understand or understand it not for the first parable and instructed for the last parable. There's a link between the first and the last. It's about people seeking, okay? But every parable in between that, which we've gone through, the tares, the mustard seed, the leaven, the hid treasure, the pearl, the net, they all have this phrase. So this is something worth colouring in, okay? Every single one of them has this phrase. So look at verse 24. Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is likened. Okay? So I've got that nicely in green here. And then down in verse 31, another parable put he forth unto them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like. And it's all the way through. Verse 33, the kingdom of heaven is like. 44, 45, 47. So these are describing the substance of the kingdom. Okay? So all the parables about the kingdom, but some are about people seeking, learning, and others are about the actual quality of the kingdom. So the key to it all is in verse 11. All right? Because when the disciples came and said, why do you speak in parables? In verse 10, he says in verse 11, he answered and said unto them, because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. Okay, the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. Maybe you'd like to write next to the word mysteries, because the kingdom is not a mystery, is it? All right, it's not unintelligible gibberish. It's very clear, but it's hidden. It's a secret. Okay, you've got to discover the secret. So I would change the word mysteries and put the word secret. The secrets of the kingdom of heaven. So you can see on the left-hand side up there, these parables are all about the secrets of the kingdom. Okay, and the first and the last one are about instruction. We're going to look at the parable of the sower, and it's going to be about, well, what type of mind will be willingly instructed about the kingdom? That's what the parable of the sower is going to look at. But in verse 52, this individual knows what the kingdom's about. He understands what the kingdom's about. Well, now that he understands that, what would he do? What would his actions look like? Well, he's always bringing out of the Bible things new and old about the kingdom. Okay? He's revealing things as a teacher, as a householder, as someone that's responsible for the others in the house. Whereas all the ones in between are what I would say are about the substance of the kingdom. What will the kingdom be like? Okay? And we can't touch on any of those things, but what might be the tares describing, do you think, about the kingdom? Or what might the mustard seed be teaching about the kingdom, do you think? Or take the mustard seed and look at verse 32 and see whereabouts in the Bible would you go to with language like this, which indeed is the least of all the seeds, but when it is grown, it is the greatest among herbs, and becometh a tree, so that the birds of the air come and lodge in the branches thereof. Where do you read about that elsewhere in the Bible? Daniel 4, that's right. And also Daniel 2, okay? So Daniel 2 and Daniel 4, God describes Nebuchadnezzar as someone who's protective of the whole realm, and all these birds and animals come and shelter in its branches, okay? Now, this is a parable about something very small, a seed, growing to something very big, okay? So Daniel is a very good example, Daniel 2, Daniel 4, about highlighting this idea of protecting the kingdom, because it has within the dream of Nebuchadnezzar something small that grows to something very big, doesn't it? You know, it has the little stone that grows so big it fills the whole earth. So this language all ties in. The kingdom of heaven is like. It's going to be something that will grow to the point where it will cover the whole earth as the waters cover the sea. So I think that's quite neat how Matthew's doing all that. But there's just one more thing about this structure which I think will help us unlock this chapter. Okay? Because it's not just 8 parables, all right? There was other things that happened in between. We just looked at one of them, a question from the disciples, and Jesus gives this answer. But there's more than just a question. There's actually 3 questions and some explanations and some reasons. Okay, questions, reasons, and explanations. But the way Matthew does it, again, you'd expect this now because we've come to know what Matthew is like. It's very ordered, it's very structured. So we see in verse 1, Jesus comes, and in verse 53, Jesus departs. Okay, so there's the boundaries of this speech that Jesus gives. And in between all that, what we find is that Jesus gives one parable, and then some things happen. Then he gives 3 parables, then some things happen. Then he gives 3 parables, then more things happen. And then he gives 1 parable. All right. It's just wonderful how Matthew has chosen to put it together so that we can see it already starting to unpack and unfold without us having to dig too deep. Because what happens in between this is that we find these questions, these reasons, these explanations tucked in between the parables as they're given. So in between parable 1 and parable 2, 3, and 4, the disciples ask Jesus a question. Jesus gives a reason for parables. Jesus then explains a parable. Then he goes and gives 3 more. And then we find a reason. It's not Jesus that necessarily does this. Matthew, as the narrator, puts this in verse 34. A reason is given for the parables from the Old Testament. The disciples ask Jesus a question again, and so Jesus explains a parable. This time it's the parable of the tares, isn't it? And then Jesus gives 3 more parables. And then we find Jesus explains another parable, okay? The parable of the fish's net. He gives an explanation for that. And now this time Jesus asks the disciples a question. And basically the question he asks them in verse 51, all right, is, do you need any more reasons? Look what he says, verse 51. Have you understood all these things? All right. Are my reasons enough? Do you get it now? And so there's no need for any more reasons because the disciple says, yes, we understand. All right. So it's all neatly packaged in, isn't it? How Matthew has done this. We find that there were 3 questions, there were 3 explanations, and there were 2 reasons. So it's probably worth just looking at the 2 reasons, I think, because they will help us unravel this parable of the sower. All right? So, 2 reasons. Why use parables? It's a good question, isn't it? Wouldn't it be so much easier if Jesus just plainly spoke, just opened his mouth and taught them, which is an expression from Matthew chapter 5, isn't it? On the Sermon on the Mount, he just opened his mouth and taught them plainly. No parables, just explained it all. Well, there's 2 very good reasons. The first reason goes from verse 11 to verse 17. And in this section, Jesus explains that when he gives a parable, what happens is that it immediately reveals 2 types of people. What sort of person are you? Will you fall into category 1 or will you fall into category 2? These 2 types of people are told to us in verse 11. He answered and said unto them, because it is given unto you, so there's one group, okay, to know the mysteries or the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not. So there's 2 types of people. All right. Now, was Jesus being especially kind to the disciples? Was he sort of giving them a helping start, being a little bit protective? Well, no. This is a principle that gets established. There's one group that want to know more, and there's another group that just say, I don't want to know any more. And I call it revelation and concealment. And you will fall into one of those 2 categories. You will be someone that wants the revelation, that will seek the revelation, or you'll be of the group that says, no, I don't want to know. I don't believe it's true. I don't think there's any truths for me to discover or find, and you will remain concealed to you. So Jesus is saying that not only is a parable designed to help those who want to know find the answers, it's also to stop those who don't want to know learning anymore. And he actually quotes from Isaiah chapter 6, verse 9 to verse 10 to prove his point. We won't go back there for sake of time, but Isaiah 6, verse 9 to 10 is quoted in verse 15, and you could go back and see how God in Isaiah 6 puts that forward to Isaiah all those years ago. All right? So parables disclose kingdom truths to believers, but at the same time, it hardens unbelievers. It does two things at the same time. So that's the first reason. Now come over to verse 34. Here's the second reason. All these things spake Jesus unto the multitude in parables, and without a parable spake he not unto them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things which have been kept secret from the foundation of the world. So there's a quote from Psalm 78, verse 2, okay? And as I said, that's Matthew putting that in there. Matthew uses this phrase that it might be fulfilled quite often throughout his gospel. Here's a messianic prophecy that said Jesus would use parables back in Psalm 78. Messiah was expected to speak in parables. And why was Messiah expected to speak in parables? Well, it's because much of the Old Testament actually is already in parabolic form. So if you want to unlock the Old Testament, you need to know how a parable works. And so Jesus, the fulfilment of the Old Testament, would be expected to also use Old Testament language. He would speak in parables too. So if you want to unlock the Old Testament, you need to know how the parables work. And if you want to know what Jesus is saying, you need to know how parables work. Now, I'll go to Psalm 78 in a moment and just show you that. But there's your two reasons that Matthew says, one from Jesus, one from Matthew, why Jesus spoke in parables. So, what is a parable then? Have you got what the word parable means written down anywhere? What's the word parable mean? Who knows? A story with a hidden meaning. A story with a hidden meaning? Yeah? Any other suggestions? That's a pretty common one, isn't it? We all say a story with a hidden meaning. Okay? So, what sort of story and what's hidden about them? Why does the meaning have to be hidden? We want to unpack that phrase. Anyone got another definition that you could put? What's the actual word parable mean? Anyone know? Let's have a look then. So, this Greek word parable, the Greek word is parabole, okay, and it means to compare together. You can see it's from two words, para, meaning close, right up alongside, and ballo, which means to throw or to cast, like a fisherman casting his line or his net or throwing something, okay? So to throw alongside, and it's actually a word descriptive of, you know how two battleships would come together and one battleship would throw out the hooks, okay, I'm not sure exactly what the technical term is, and then they would have a whole lot of men throwing these things out, and then they'd haul it at once and bring that other boat right up alongside, all right? To throw alongside, pull up alongside. That's the meaning behind the word, right? And so what it is, it's about comparing two things alongside each other, so close. And in this case, what's being compared is an everyday story, all right alongside kingdom truths, all right? And you pull them together to take a spiritual truth and put a story right alongside it. That's what's happening here. So you may want to just see it on the screen, but if you'd like to just open up Psalm 78, okay, which is that psalm talking about Jesus, or Matthew saying it's talking about Jesus, all right, and it's quite a lengthy psalm all about the history of Israel. Now, I just do this out of interest to show you why Matthew thought it would be an appropriate Old Testament prophecy to demonstrate how parables are used in the Old Testament. At first glance, anyone familiar with this chapter could maybe identify some parable-type language. Anyone got any that they can see? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there's some things in here that clearly can't be taken literally. So some of you may have done some work on this and may have something highlighted or coloured in. Any sort of, and I'm told a parable doesn't have to be a lengthy story with the spiritual truth contained inside. It can just be a metaphor, it can be figurative language, it's basically quite wide as a concept, covers all of those things that we would sometimes break down in English grammar, okay? Anyone see any? Excellent, okay, so I had that one down, all right, so I've put a little marker next to them all, and there's quite a lot. But verse 39, Sam's highlighted this one, for he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that pass away. Now, people aren't wind. They might be full of wind sometimes, but they're not wind, okay? They're described here as a wind that passes away, all right? And cometh not again. And if you go outside and see the leaves blowing and the wind, that wind goes and it never comes back again. More wind comes, maybe, but that wind's gone. So it's not literal, is it? It's using parable language. So, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Okay, so a feast in the wilderness. A fire was kindled against Jacob. Not a literal fire, clearly. All right. He opened the doors of heaven. I've been outside and seen, big metal doors. It's clearly figurative language. He rained down manna, gave them the corn of heaven. Now, the manna didn't get rained down. It just appeared in the morning. Man did eat angels' food. Well, angels don't even eat food. All right? They live forever. They don't need to eat. So you got all of this descriptive language here. God was their rock. Well, God's not a rock. Okay? God's a spirit being. But he's immovable. He's like a rock. There is the one Sam mentioned. They were a wind that passeth away. And then you get these ones, like this one, his own people to go forth like sheep. Remember Matthew 13, the kingdom of heaven is like. So it's picking up that same language. And all the way through. All right? So quite a lot. So quite an appropriate chapter for Matthew to use in Matthew 13. All right? So come back to Matthew 13. This parable of the sower. So a lot of structure, a lot of background, piecing this all together, finding out why did Jesus do this. And this first parable becomes sort of like the pinnacle of all the parables and gets used in all three synoptic gospels. So what about this parable? Well, Jesus takes an everyday event, all right, something that probably not every day, but seasonally, they would have seen this happen regularly, a sower out there sowing seed in a field. Probably not a massive field like you see today on grand scales, okay, just something the farmer can manage, all right? And we're introduced to three ideas in this parable. Clive already read it in verse 1 to 9, so we don't need to read it again. But we're introduced to a sower who's throwing out seed upon different soils. All right, so SSS. All right? Sower, seed, soil. And it's fairly evident what each are meant to represent. We get told that by Jesus, and we get even more information in the other synoptic gospels. The sower is clearly Jesus. The seed, well, we saw it in verse 19 already, but let's remind ourselves again. When anyone heareth the word of the kingdom, in other words, anyone that hears the seed, the word of the kingdom. So all the truths about the kingdom of God. Now, of course, we would call that the gospel now, wouldn't we? We would say the gospel is the things concerning the kingdom of God and the name of Jesus Christ. So here's the gospel message, the word of the kingdom. And you may like to colour this in a different colour. This idea of word comes out in verse 19, verse 20, verse 21, verse 22, verse 23. So it doesn't say word of the kingdom every single time. It truncates it down to just word in verse 20, 21, 22, 23. But clearly, we're meant to understand that it's the word of the kingdom in every case, in every situation of the different soils. Okay? And then we come across the idea of soil. And the soil, the clue to the soil is only found in the first of the 4 soils. And that's in verse 19. But the idea is meant to be carried through. So verse 19, when anyone heareth the word of the kingdom, that is the seed, and they don't understand it, then cometh the wicked one and catcheth away that which was sown in his heart. So the soil is meant to represent one's heart. And heart in the Bible is a metaphor for our thinking, our minds, isn't it? How we think, what goes in to the grey matter between our ears, that's our heart, says this parable, our minds. So it's pretty straightforward, these 3 things, aren't they? So I don't think we need to spend too much time unravelling that. But then these 4 soils get more information, don't they? These 4 soils. What about the wayside? Well, we sort of have to go back to verse 1 to 9 to see the parable, and then we come across to verse 19 to 23 to see the interpretation. Remember, we had reasons and explanations and questions in between, didn't we? So let's remind ourselves about the parable of the wayside. This is really hard ground, okay, where the sower has been treading up and down. He's created a pathway. This is not designed to be where he's going to grow the seed. He doesn't bother to water this. It's never been furrowed, okay? It's never been turned over. It's really compacted soil. But of course, throwing out seeds, some of them has fallen on this wayside. And there it goes. It sits on the surface. Maybe he treads on it, and so it does sink just down below. But the point is, this seed never germinates. It never starts germinating and putting down roots, okay? It cannot germinate. It's unable to penetrate that hard, uncultivated surface. And so, of course, the birds flying around, all right, see easy pickings and say, right, I'm coming down, I'll grab those ones. Because the other seeds that fall into the furrows, all right, and all that overturned soil, it falls in and it's hard for the bird to find, but not on the wayside. What does Jesus say about this soil? He says they hear, okay, they've heard the gospel, but they choose not to understand. I want you to just take that on board. It's not that I don't know what it's saying. It's not a stupidity. It's that they choose not to understand, okay? Because what they have in their heart is something else stopping it from penetrating in. It's called the birds in the parable, but Jesus calls it the wicked one, okay? So there's something guarding their heart. It's not a heart that's receptive to new ideas. It's got this guard around it. It's called the wicked one. The wicked one in Scripture, it's called the devil in Mark, and it's called Satan in Luke. You get all 3, all right? Satan, the devil, and the wicked one. We call them different personifications for sin, don't we? So they've got sin guarding around their heart, their pride, okay, and all their preconceived ideas, stopping this new truth about the kingdom penetrating through. So what are we meant to understand? Well, though they hear these individuals, okay, remember verse 19, when anyone, so these are individuals, and they could be religious, they could be Roman Catholic, they could be Jehovah's Witnesses, or they could be atheists. They could be anyone, all right, religious or not. When they have preconceived ideas that surround their minds and put up iron bars, it gives no chance for the gospel truths of the kingdom to enter in and be understood. And they stay ignorant. Understand it not, verse 19 said. They stay ignorant. Okay, so there's your wayside. There's your hard-trodden path. So at the judgment seat, okay, Jesus will say to any in this category, if, for whatever reason they were responsible because they have heard the gospel but choose not to accept it, okay, Jesus will say, sorry, you can't enter in. Why? Well, the problem is your heart was too hard. All right. They've got excuses. And all these preconceived ideas stop them. Your heart is too hard. What about the stony ground? Well, let's remind ourselves, what's the parable say? Well, Stony Ground, you can even see it when you're driving up to Glenlock. You'll see patches of ground where the tractor has gone around it because there's these rocks just too big to bother to try and extract out, and they go around it. A sower back then probably had smaller rocks to deal with, and apart from taking them by hand, probably gather them into a place and just leaves them. And soil and dirt falls on that, and in time, it's got a bit of dirt on it, and if a seed were to fall on that, it can start to germinate, and the seed does germinate, but it has no ability to put down roots, okay, because it hits the stone pretty soon on, and so access to water and trying to extract nutrients from the ground, non-existent, can't happen. And I can't remember if it's Mark or Luke says that they had no access to water. No moisture was in the earth. Matthew doesn't mention that, but clearly that's part of this parable. All right? So they've got no resilience. And of course, when the sun was to come up, that heat from the sun causes it to wilt and die almost instantly. All right? So Jesus says, these are they that hear, verse 20, but he that received the seed, so this seed's gone into their heart, all right? The same is he that heareth the word and anon with joy receives it. So they've received it. That means they've understood it, okay? Unlike verse 19. They understand it. And they initially receive it with joy. But the first heat of trial, whether it's from outside or inside, they suddenly wilt and they give up. So these are individuals whose faith is superficial, okay? Not grounded in the truths of the reality of the coming kingdom. That's sort of like still just a bit of a myth. It's not a reality in their lives, helping them to conduct their lives. And when any trial comes, they cave to it. And these pressures could come from the world outside or from the ecclesia within. I remember in Enfield instructing a young couple through the seminars. They came into the truth and they stayed for about 2 years. And they had a little child, and someone made a comment about their child making a noise in the meeting, and maybe they could have done it a better way, that's true, all right? But it was quite, for them, a lot of pressure, and it felt like a trial. And they became so offended by it, they left the truth. See what verse 21 says? Yet hath he not root in himself, but dureth for a while, for when tribulation or persecution ariseth because of the word, by and by he is offended. Okay? So it's not necessarily a terminal sickness type trial that does this. It could be a word that's said in the wrong tone or in the wrong way. And because there's no roots, okay, there's no stability, they fall over. Well, what might Jesus say to them? Well, your heart was too shallow. Too shallow. We use that phrase, don't we? Oh, a very shallow person. You can't be shallow with the gospel message, can you? It's the seed of the kingdom. Nothing to be shallow about. So the thorny ground. The thorny ground. Let's remind ourselves about the parable of the thorny ground. Well, here again, the seed is thrown into this soil and it germinates, sets down roots, good long roots, gathers as much nutrients as it can, but it finds that there are other roots already in this soil that it wasn't aware of, already planted, and the farmer hadn't bothered to get those other sort of seeds out. They're thorns and thistle type seeds, weeds, all right? And so they're competing with the good seed for nutrient and for water, and of course, this good seed tries to grow up strong and tall, and it gets to a certain height, but it can never fully mature, can never bring forth any fruit. And so that's what Jesus says. He says, these are they that hear, but time spent with other desires. And they're all different desires that are mentioned in all the parables of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew calls it the care of this world, verse 22, and the deceitfulness of riches, okay? The other Gospels say similar things, but they add more in. Basically, anything that takes up more energy and time is going to compete with your desire to find out about the gospel truths of the kingdom. And so it can't produce fruit. So their faith is competing with many other things that over time take priority and consume their time and energy. So what might Jesus say to this group at the judgment seat? I'm sorry, but your heart was too cluttered, too busy. You didn't prioritize. You had all these other things competing. And then, of course, we come to the final soil, the good ground. And in this case, the seed does germinate. It does put down deep roots. It does grow to maturity with amazing results. 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. Like incredible results. And Jesus says in verse 23, he that receives seed, so they understand it, and they're stable about that, and they put down roots. He that receives seed into the good ground is he that heareth the word, and they understand it, and they bear fruit. All three things, you see. And then they bring forth an abundance, an incredible abundance of fruit. Their faith prioritizes the truth of the kingdom only. Nothing else gets in the way, allowing them to focus on preparing for its coming, okay? And at the judgment seat, there are no excuses. They've never had an excuse. They've always put the truth first. Oh, I'm too busy. Oh, it's too hard. None of that, because their heart has been receptive. So that's how Jesus puts this parable. Why did he use the parable of the sower? Well, it's quite interesting. You may like to take this up further, but there are many places in the Old Testament that take this idea and it's already found in the Old Testament. Jesus is just bringing it together, and Matthew's putting it in this section on his speech about the parables, about the kingdom. They were already mentioned in the Old Testament. So remember we said one of the things you needed to do was to understand how parables work, because you need to be able to unlock parables in the Old Testament. So if your mind was already attuned to some of these things, and I'm sure the disciples probably were, they would have come across the idea of fallowed ground, for example, back in Jeremiah chapter 4. So their minds were already receptive. Break up your fallow ground and sow not among thorns. That's the parable of the sower, isn't it? All right. And all the way through, Hosea 10, Hosea 1, there's an individual called Jezreel, who's a type of Jesus Christ. And he's called Jezreel because his name means God sows. So who's the sower? God's the sower in Hosea. Okay, Jesus is the sower here in Matthew 13. He's following in the footsteps, as it were, of his own father. So that was just interesting, I thought, there to see all these seeds to this parable are already there in the Old Testament. And the one that I really liked was Genesis 26, which I hadn't connected before, but this was an amazing thing in Genesis 26 where Isaac sowed and received in the same year and hundredfold. That would have been an incredible crop back then. And of course, Jesus picks that up here. But I just want to finish on this point here, because what are we really meant to take away from this parable? What's Jesus trying to zone in on? Okay, it's nice to hear about these different soils and identify, yes, I think I'm in the good ground. I think that's the parable part for me. I understand that. Yes, there might be things that are impacting me, thorns, but I am endeavouring to be in the good ground. Well, that's not quite enough, because what Jesus, I think, is really wanting us to take away, this would be the take-home message, is that God is interested in only one thing in our lives. Right? One thing, and that is to produce fruit. That is our purpose. There's lots of things that happen around all of that, but the one thing that God wants from us is to bring fruit. And so in Matthew 13, verse 23, you'll notice that Jesus says the good ground is one that hears, well, they all heard in all four grounds, and understands, well, that's different to the wayside because they didn't understand, and bears fruit. Now, that's different to the stony ground and the thorny ground. They couldn't bring forth fruit. All the other three could not bring forth fruit. The only one that could bring forth fruit was the good ground. All right? And I'll just put these quotes up here, and you can be looking at that. But I just thought it would be good to take away this concept of what does growth look like? What does producing fruit look like? Okay, so just imagine that you've been invited to, I don't know, a birthday party for a 1-year-old, all right? So this child's turning 1 and you've been invited to the party, and you see Dad there. Dad's proud as punch, holding the baby, okay? And Mum, she's pleased as well, and she's prepared all this food. Grandma, Grandpa, the whole family's there, and they're celebrating this birthday of a 1-year-old. And they all sing happy birthday, and the baby giggles and then turns to the dad and says the first words it's ever said in its life, and says, Dada, or something like that, all right? And everyone's so excited, all right? This is the baby's first words. They've never heard the baby say any words before, okay? Dad's punching the air, all right? He thinks the baby said daddy, right? He swears the baby said daddy, but Mum corrects him, but she's still pleased as punch, all right? Grandma faints because this is her grandbaby saying its first words, all right? Grandpa faints too, but I think that's probably because he's had too much. But there's this opportunity to witness growth in this child, this first-year-old saying its first words. Now, just imagine you went away, you lived overseas for 20 years, and you come back, and it just happens to be that this 1-year-old's now turning 21, and it's having a birthday, and you're celebrating his 21st birthday. Everyone is there again, and you're all singing happy birthday, and you stand there and you're expecting this 21-year-old to say some words, and it starts, and all it says is Dada. That's all it can say. All right? Dad doesn't punch the air, does he? Dad punches his face. He's clearly embarrassed. All right? Mum bursts into tears. Grandma faints again. All right? Grandpa, he comes up and says, I don't know what's going on, but maybe you'd like some of this because it might help you understand what's happening here. Because that's not expected, is it? Just imagine 20 years goes by and there's no evidence of fruit. 20 years of no spiritual growth, no spiritual fruit. It's absurd, isn't it? That story is quite absurd, all right? You know, some parents might say, oh, well, my boy still hardly says any words, all right? But we all expect more as we go in life growing up. And imagine we get to the judgment seat and Jesus says, I've seen no growth. There's no fruit. You've spent 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, a lifetime, and I can't see any evidence of fruit. So there's just some quotes there that just highlight how we have to develop spiritual fruit. And of course, the fruit of the Spirit is the obvious one in Galatians chapter 5 there. So I just thought, really take that on board and just think about it tonight and see what evidence of growth has there been in your life. Otherwise, you could end up looking as absurd as that 21-year-old. So let's just wrap up with a summary of what we've looked at tonight. We've looked at quite a bit, but I've just chosen these 4 things here to summarise. So parables are a natural story aligned with a spiritual truth. Bring alongside and compare the two and see what's hidden within. God has revealed many of his truths through the mode of parables throughout the Old Testament, so we need to have this ability to unlock them. Parables reveal 2 types of people based on their response. There's the true seekers versus the proud, who it stays concealed to. And the parable of the sower reveals, as we've just seen, that God really does desire us to develop spiritual fruit. Thanks, Mike.
Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching. And remember to come back soon.